And yeah, I'm gonna get started now. Um, I'm gonna start by adding some images. Um, so I'm gonna go to my Replit page and go into my MMP 310 folder and open up my web app. And I'm still just gonna keep working. I'm not gonna change the code that we've written so far too much. So I'm just gonna keep working on what we've got. Now I'm gonna try to just do the settings again. There we go. Now it works. Okay. So I'm gonna turn my font size bigger so it's easier for you guys to see. And okay. So what we've got so far, we have a bunch of references to our HTML, so we can plug stuff into our HTML page in JavaScript. Then we have a few things for our user, some information. Then we have our little onboarding section at the beginning where the user puts in their username and their character type. Um, and then we have our scene data, and our scene data has all of our little scenes in it, as the intro, the forest scene, the cove scene, the mouse scene, the spider, skeleton, and jellyfish scene. That's a lot of scenes. And we're gonna add a little bit into the data. And then we also have our setup scene function, which does most of the work of our project. It clears the previous scene. It gets the text of the new scene and the options for where you go after that from the scene data. Then it sets the text in the message at the top of the page. And then we loop over the options and create a button to click on each option. So what we're going to do today is have an optional image, and there's obviously lots of different types of content that you could add in here. You could add videos, you could add other pieces of text, but I'm just going to use images as an example because they work a little bit differently than the rest of our HTML. But they're kind of similar, so it's not going to be a huge difference. So we're going to add some images in first, and then we will add some CSS. So I'm gonna find a couple of images to use, and I'm only gonna set this up for my first scene. I'm not gonna go through all of the scenes, but in my first scene, I have this text, and then I have two options to go to function forest and to go to conditional cove. So I'm gonna add an image of these two locations just to add some, media to the experience. So I'm just gonna Google forest and go to the images page. And I'm gonna go to tools and make sure to use Creative Commons images. And let's find a nice image to use. Let's see, this is kind of nice. This is kind of cool looking. Looks like a little path. So that kind of goes along with our story. Um, So for this one, there's a few different options of different sizes on Wikimedia. I'm gonna go with 640. That's probably a little bit bigger than I need, but it'll definitely be big enough. And usually I like to download and re-upload stuff, but I'm just gonna take this URL and copy it. I'm just gonna use this directly. So I have a forest image, and let's get a cove image. So I'm gonna Google cove and go to images. I have to reset this again. I have to go back to tools and go to Creative Commons. And this is a pretty good cove, this first one here also from Wikimedia. So that's nice. We've got two Wikimedia images. I'm gonna grab 640. For some reason that 640 is much bigger than this 640. I must have clicked on the wrong one. 640. There we go. Okay. So now I have two images, and I can load these images just by copying these URLs. So I'm going to use the URLs instead of downloading the data. I'm just being a little bit lazy here, but usually I would recommend downloading the images and re-uploading them to your project. Anyway, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put an image URL, and then I'm going to just paste in the forest URL. So I'm going to copy that and put some quotation marks and then paste. And that's kind of long, so it makes our code a little bit janky, but this is still just a key and a value, image URL, and that's the URL. And then for our cove, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say image URL, put some quotation marks, and then grab my cove URL. So I'm going to copy that and paste. So now I've got two images to use. And one of the things, what I want to go over is that all of my options are going to have like some text to, say what it is, and then a place that it's going to go next. But not all of them, at least for now, are going to have images. So we're going to look at how we can have options. So maybe some have images, maybe some have other pieces of text or other pieces of media. Maybe you could have audio. So I'm going to show how to do that by loading this image URL optionally into the scene. So I've updated my data, and this is each one of these images is going to go along with my options. So it's part of the option. See, I have this option list, and there's two options in the list. One is for this forest here, and one is for the cove here. So I'm going to go inside of my option for loop, and I'm just going to add, right now I'm taking out the text and this next value, which is the next scene we go to. And now I'm going to also take out the image URL. So if I scroll down to my scene, here's where I loop over my options. And here's where I destructure the option. I get the text and the next value from each option in my loop. So I'm going to add my image URL value here. And what I'm going to do first is show that since not all of my scenes have an image, sometimes this is going to be undefined. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to console.log image URL, and then I'm going to run my project. And let's open a new browser and open up the console. And as I go through, you'll see that when I go to this first one, notice I have my two images here. So each image is associated with each one of my options for this part of my story. If I click here, then it's just undefined, undefined. And if I click here, again, it's undefined, undefined. Okay, so if the image doesn't exist, I want to check, because if it doesn't exist, I don't want to add it. This is actually a little bit like the null notes we were just looking at in Gall's project. So what I want to do is say if image URL. And one of the nice things about JavaScript is it can use type as a Boolean. So if this is undefined, this will be false, and then this code will never run. So if I say Boolean of undefined, that's false. Whereas Boolean of, some URL, that's going to be true. So all I have to do to check if the URL exists is say if and then image URL. If it's undefined, then I'll ignore this code. Okay, so so this is an optional image. Optional image, check if it exists. So if the image exists, we want to make an image element and add it to our scene container. So our scene container has all of the components in our scene in it. So first I need to make an image tag. So I'm going to make a new HTML tag. I'm going to say constant img, shorthand for image. And I'm going to say document.create element. And the image tag is just img. I don't know why that one is abbreviated and some aren't, like button, but that's just how it looks. So I have my image tag. And with an image tag, the way that I assign the image is I just say image.source equals image URL. Okay, so this is taking the URL that I copied up here, and it's actually putting it in as the source to the HTML image. And then finally, I'm just going to add this image to my scene container. So I'm going to say scene container dot append child and img. Okay, and I think that's everything I need to do. So again, this doesn't have to be an image. It could be another piece of text. You can add as many variables as you want into your data and then add them as options in your project. So I'm going to restart this. So let's do this again. Okay, so there you see my images. And I still have my options to click on, but now I have some images to kind of illustrate or make my story a little bit more interesting. But it kind of is starting to look weird now, right? Because we have more content. So let's also add some CSS to kind of style this and make it look a little bit better. So before we add some CSS, we're going to change one aspect of how our JavaScript works. You probably remember from previous programming classes that when we're using CSS, we need like more structure to our JavaScript. So right now in our CSS, we have this scene container, but in here we just have like a button, an image, another button, like they're all just kind of dumped in here. And if we want to group them together, we're going to have to add more HTML to group these different options together so that we have an easier way of styling. So I'm going to create a container for each option. And so we'll have a little more structure to our HTML, and then we'll add some classes. So we can use CSS rules based on classes. So the first thing I'm going to do right now, I'm just appending everything into the scene container. But before I do that, I want to make a container for my options. So each option is going to have its own container and then that gets added to the scene container. So I'm going to say constant option container, and I'm going to say document.create elements and call this option-container. Or wait, no, my element's a div, sorry. Okay, so I have a new div. And so now I want to give this a class so I can style it in CSS. So I'm going to say option container dot class list. This is the list of classes for each element. And then I'm going to add to this list, I'm going to add the class option container. So we haven't done this yet. This is a way that I can add a CSS class to an element that I create in JavaScript. And so then whenever styles I put in my CSS for that class will be added to the container. And so now I need to add my container, my option container to my scene container. So we're starting to see that structuring things is a little bit tricky, but it's important to get it set up to add styles. So I'm going to say scene container dot append child option container. And now instead of adding my button and my image to my scene, I'm going to add them to the option. And we'll see the result of that is that I have two option containers that contain my content. So I'm going to replace scene container here with option container. And then I'm going to scroll down a little bit, replace this scene container with this option container. So as we're starting to add more structure to our project, we definitely have a lot more JavaScript, but because we're in this nice little loop, we only have to do this once. We're only doing this once for each button. So I'm going to refresh here. And now when we get to this page, it still looks the same because we haven't added styles yet. But now look how much better the structure is. I have one option up here, so I can style that by itself. And then I have another option down here, which I can also add styles to. And so the styles that I apply to both of these will, they will, get applied to each one separately. Okay, so now we're ready to do some styling. And one thing that I like to do is use Chrome to test things. So I'm going to show you guys a couple things that I'm going to use before we actually commit it to our CSS page. So what I want to do with my options is put them next to each other. I think that'll be a good design choice. Depending on how many options you have, I only have two options for each scene, so that's going to be easy for me. If you have more than that, you may want to go with a different design. But what I'm going to use is some basic styles and then some CSS grid stuff. Hopefully, maybe you guys have seen CSS grid in previous classes. If not, I'm going to go over some of the basics, but it's a really powerful rule set to use to create layouts. So the first thing I want to do is turn my scene container into a grid. So I'm going to say display is grid. And that doesn't change anything because I haven't said anything about how I want my grid to work. But now I'm going to give my grid some options. I'm going to say grid template columns. And this is how many columns I want in my grid. So I'm going to do two columns, and I'm going to use the FR unit. That basically just says make these take up the same amount of space. I'm going to do one FR, and suddenly, look, my content is sitting next to each other. So that is pretty nice. That it's just two rules, and we've already got our layout a little bit better. Now, I don't want it to take up, I don't want it to overflow over the side of the page. So I'm going to set the width to 100%. And I'm going to set a max width as well. So it'll fit with the page up to a certain extent, but if we get too big, I don't want it to keep going. So I'll set the max width to like 960 pixels. That's usually what I set it around. And we're not going to see this work quite yet because our images are still really big, but we're going to fix that in a second. So once we have our grid set up, we can also add a gap. We can say grid gap is, let's just say 1em as a default. That'll put a nice little gap in between our columns. And so this is pretty good. I'm going to set this up and then I'll make some other changes when we go back. So I'm going to use the scene container and I'm going to add these rules that I've got so far. So I'm going to go back to my code and go to style.css. And right now I have some basic stuff. One thing I'm going to add in here that you really want to put in pretty much every project is I'm going to do this rule. I'm going to do an asterisk to select all of the elements. I actually did this down here for the font size, but I wrote remove later here, so I'm going to create a different rule for this. And this is called box sizing. You may have heard of this before. I'm going to set this to border box. This is going to make my layouts work a little bit better because it's going to include the things like the margin and padding. It's going to calculate those as part of the width and height of my elements. So I'm just going to add that in real quick. That, I put in pretty much every CSS file I write. So now I'm going to go and add those rules that I just created for my scene container. So I'm going to do a hashtag for ID and do scene container. And I'm going to set the display style to grid. And I'm going to set the grid template columns to 1FR, 1FR. Again, FR just stands for fraction. And it basically is saying as many of these things as I make, I want them to be divided evenly. So 1 and 1 is 2 columns. Then I want my grid gap to be 1em. I want my width to be 100% of the window. And I want my max width to be 960 pixels. So I think that's going to be pretty good for my scene container. The next thing that I'm going to style is my dot option container. So I'm going to put a style in here, and let's try some stuff out in Chrome, and then we'll add our rules. So I'm going to go back to my page. I'm going to get to this part. Okay, so I've got my scene container, and it's got the grid set up. And so if I click on here and go to my option container, now I can start to make some rules in here that will make things fit a little bit better. So one of the things I want to make sure to do is my images should be 100% of their container. So I'll just put that in here real quick. I'll say width is 100%. So this way the images aren't going to take up too much space. This isn't necessarily the best way to do this, but it is the simplest. Okay, so now my images kind of fit more. And now I can do some more interesting things with my layout. One of the nice things about using CSS Grid is I don't actually have to have things in the order that they appear in HTML to put them in different orders. So with my grid, I'm actually going to make each one of my option containers also a grid. So I'm going to say option container display is also grid, but I'm going to do a different type of grid. I'm going to do an area-based grid. So I'm going to say grid areas. And for this one, I just have to say the name of the areas I want in order. So for my grid areas, whoops, this is going to be hard to write. I want the image to go first and the button to go next. It didn't like that. I think I have to put a, Chrome does not want me to do this. How about if I take this out? Oh no, it's grid template areas, not just grid areas, grid template areas. There we go. Okay. So this doesn't change anything quite yet, but we're going to see it in a second. And then I'm also going to add a grid gap here, 1em. So now you can see the gap between the button and the image. So then I'm going to set which area I want my images to be in. I'm actually going to add a rule here because this will be easier. I'm going to hit plus here. And then for my option container image, I can say grid area is image. Now see how the image is above the button. This makes styling much, much faster. I can do the same thing with the button. I don't really need to at this point, but if I click here and say option container button, grid area is button, now I can just use the names for things that I want and my design updates for me. So this is a much better design than what we had previously. I don't know why my buttons are so large, but I'm not going to think too much about it right now. I can always fix that later. So now I have a pretty simple and slightly responsive design with my uh, project. So I'm going to go add in those rules. Hopefully I can remember all of them. So I'm going to go back to my style sheet. So for my option container, the display again is grid. And for this one, I'm using grid template areas instead of columns. Oops. And the first area, I want the image on top. And then I want the button. So if you have more than 2 columns or 2 areas, you could do something like this. I could put image and then button, and then they'll be next to each other instead of on top of each other. And then you can have as many rows as you want. I could have other stuff below here. So there's a lot you can do with the grid template areas. I'm going to add the same grid gap, 1em. And then I just have to add my 2 rules, my option dash container and image. So any image that's inside the option container, its grid area will be image. And any, whoops, any button that is inside of my option container will have grid area button. Okay, so I think I'm almost done with my CSS. That was not too many rules, and we've already got a nice little layout going. Uh-oh, what did I forget? I forgot my images need to be width 100% so they don't break the layout. There we go. Okay, so now if I want an image inside of my option or some other text or whatever, I can put the image in there, and then my styling will update with my project. So again, this is good for something if you have if you just have 2 options. If you have more than 2 options, what you might want to use instead of a grid, because a grid is good if you know exactly how many columns or areas you're going to have. If you don't know that, what I would use instead of a grid is I would use a flex box. So I would just say display as flex. That will stick everything next to each other. And that one, it doesn't even have to know how many options there are. If I add more options, it'll go along with it. So if you have 2 or a set number of columns that you want to use, if every scene has 3 options and you want to lay them out that way, grid is a good way to go. If not, Flexbox is probably a better way to go. Also, you don't have to, design them this way. I'm just showing an example of how you might want to set up your layout. All right, I think that's everything I want to cover for the CSS. I'm trying to remember if there's anything else I want to do. I haven't added any other real styles like fonts or colors or anything like that. But I assume you guys know how to do that. If not, if you have something specific you want to do CSS wise, let me know and we can figure out how to do it. But mostly what I want to do is show how to connect our CSS and our JavaScript. So the way that we can do that is either by using classes or setting the styles directly. So let's go back to our JavaScript. So in this case, I added a class, and by using that class, I can style elements that are either part of that class or inside of that class. And so this is a little bit different than what we did previously, which is setting the styles directly through JavaScript by using style.setProperty. So either way is useful. If we have a style sheet and we want to apply it to a lot of styles, that's a good way to do it. If we just have one property that we want to set, you may just do it in JavaScript. It may be more easier. It may be more efficient to do it that way. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is add in if you have like some other element that you want to put in your HTML but show up at some point in your project, I want to show how to do that. So this is kind of like a wildcard thing. This was actually something that Janine originally was sort of asking about, and she's not here right now, but I think I mostly understand what she was talking about, and I think it may be useful for other people as well. So what Janine was asking about is what if I wanted to have a P5 sketch show up at some point in my project? So uh, having that happen is a little more complicated than just putting text in and then adding the message, or putting an option in and then adding a button, or putting a image in. So if you have something specific that you want to show in your project that's going to be hard to create in JavaScript, what we can do is just write it in HTML and then just reveal it in JavaScript. So we can use our JavaScript to show the scene when we're ready. So that's the last bit that I'm going to do for this project. So I'm just going to add a little P5 sketch. So we'll return to our good old friend P5. So I'm going to start by adding some HTML. I'm going to go back to the HTML page. And obviously, if we want P5, we need our P5 library. So I'm just going to go to CDN P5 and grab a link to the P5 library. Just going to copy this. And so we'll add a new script in here and say script source equals and paste in this P5 link. Okay, so now I've got P5, and I could write my P5 JavaScript right into script.js, but it'll be easy to kind of keep these separately. So I'm going to add another script file here for my P5 thing. I'm not going to do like a real sketch. I'm just going to show this as an example, um, just to get started. Okay, so now we have a couple more things to work with. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a container for a P5 sketch that we're not going to see when we start our thing, but we'll have a way of revealing it when we're ready. So under my scene container, I'm going to put a new div ID, and I'm going to call this, just as an example, special section. So if we have a special section that we want to reveal at some point, you don't have to call it special section. I'm just doing that as an example. And inside my special section, I'm going to have a P5 parent container to throw my P5 canvas in. So we're not going to see this at the beginning of our sketch, but at a certain point in my story that I want to use the P5, I will reveal this P5 section. Okay, so that's all of the HTML I need to add. Let's go over to our style.css. And just like we don't want to show our character type at the beginning, we also don't want to show our special section at the beginning. So I'm just going to add a compound rule here. I'm going to put a comma after character type and do ID special section. Is that what I called it? Yes. And so both of these will have display none. Since I'm applying this rule to multiple different IDs, I can just put a comma in between them and have a compound CSS rule. So now we have both of those are going to be display none to start. So let's take a look at it over here. Actually, let's make our P5 sketch first, and then we'll take a look at it. So I'm going to add a new file. Let's make a file. Where do I make a file? Let's find a file. If I hit plus, oh, new file isn't an option. Let's see. Maybe I need to open the menu. Okay, add a file here, sketch.js. And I'm just gonna make a really ridiculously simple P5 sketch. I'm just gonna say function setup. And then I have to attach my canvas to the special section. So I made that P5 container. So I'm going to say variable canvas equals create canvas 400, 400. And then I'm going to say canvas.parent to P5 container. So that way I know my P5 sketch is inside of my um, special section. Okay, so then I'll say function draw, and I'm just going to set a random fill and draw a random ellipse. So I'm just setting this up to be quick. Obviously, if you have something specific you want to do with this content, you can do that here. But now I just have like a really, really basic P5 sketch that will show some random stuff. And let's just do no strokes, just so it'll look a little bit more interesting. So now, if I go back over here, as long as I wrote this right and there's no errors, yeah, there is this special section, and in here, there is a P5 container, and in there, there's actually a canvas, but we can't see it. But if I do turn it on, there's the goofy P5 sketch that I just created. So all we have to do to reveal this to our user is turn the display on. And so we can do that whenever we want. We just have to set up our JavaScript code to turn this display on. So that's the last thing we're going to do. I'm going to close this and go back to, where is it? Script.js. And so again, we're going to have to decide which scene we want this to happen in. I'm just going to choose a random scene. So let's put it in the jellyfish scene. So in here, I'm going to put a new parameter under the text. So it's still going to have text, it's still going to have options, but it's also going to have this optional parameter called reveal. And then we're going to select the ID in our HTML that we want to reveal. So I'm going to reveal the special section ID. And if you had multiple sections, you could do like a list here, but you could also just put them all into one section. So it's good enough to just have it as one value. So this is just an ID. So I'll put a comment here, ID of HTML section to show at this point in the story. So this is going to look really similar to how we did our images before, which is why I wanted to do them together. So right now, when we load a scene, we're just getting the text and the options from that scene. But now we have an optional value, this potential reveal section. So that's another thing that we can get out of our scene. So I'm going to get it out here. But again, it's optional, so I have to check if it exists first. So I'm going to check if reveal exists. I'm going to say if reveal. And if it is there, then we're just going to find it in our HTML and then turn the display on. So to find it in the HTML, I'm going to go constant reveal element. This is the element with this ID is document.get element by ID. And then it's just whatever that reveal is. Okay, so I'm using this variable. So if it's special section, that's what's going to be added here. So I'm going to get a reference to that special section. And then I'm just going to say reveal element dot style dot set property. So I don't need CSS for this. I mean, I am setting the CSS, but I can just do this in JavaScript. I'm going to set the display to block for this one. That will show it. Okay, so let's try it. So I put in my name and I'm a designer and I have to remember where to go now. So I go to the conditional cove and I look at the jellyfish and nothing happened. Okay, what did we miss? The display is still none. Okay, so something got missed. Let's see if we can figure it out. So let's log a couple things. Let's console.log reveal. And then let's console.log reveal element. And let's see what it tells us. I'm going to do a hard refresh just to make sure it's not cached. Okay, so I put in my name, going to go to the jellyfish. Okay, now it works. So it was probably, I think the script must have just been cached. So it didn't do what we asked it to do. But now we can at least see that it works. And there's our P5 sketch. So that's cool. One last thing that we have to do, if I go back to the beginning, the P5 sketch is still there. So if I do have a reveal, I not only have to reveal it, but I also have to get rid of it when I leave. So let's make sure to do that. So I'm going to get rid of these logs. And I'm going to copy this whole section and then come down here to my button. So for both buttons, if I go to the next scene, if there's also a reveal, I want to get rid of the reveal. So I am going to do exactly the same thing, except instead of changing the display to block, I'm going to change the display back to none. So I still need to check if it's there. I still need to grab a reference to it in the HTML, and then I need to turn the display to none. So now this will make it go away, hopefully. Okay, so if I go to the conditional cove and I look at the jellyfish, there's my special section. Again, it could be P5, it could be a new form, it could be some other HTML. This is just one example. And now if I click back to beginning, now my P5 sketch goes away and I can go through my stuff again. And if I come back to the jellyfish, there it is again. And if I go to the skeleton, it's not there. So yeah, so there we go. So now we can add more HTML or more content into our scene data, but we can also just add some HTML into our project and then reveal that HTML in the scene that we want to. All right, so I think that's everything that I want to cover for this project. So that's good. As I mentioned before, I think we could spend more time on this, but I'd rather just move on to the final project. And I think we've covered enough that you guys could kind of keep going with this if this was something that you wanted to do for the final to keep working on this. So I'm going to stop here. Let me stop the recording.